Welcome to the Tenet Podcast. My name is Todd Pearson here in Denver, Colorado, and I'm joined by my good friend, partner, brother, Wes Brown.
Todd, it's good to see you. I'm excited about today's conversation. Usually we have some fun banter to go with. Hey, you know what? It's a new world. I'm starting January 1 right now. It's a new world, new president. I think this is going to be, January 6th of last year, 2021 / the beginning of 2021. I thought it was going to be a great year. Then that happened. And I think we're going to have an interesting conversation today because it's going to relate to some of that. So I'm excited. Todd, how are you today?
Not as energetic and ready to rock and roll as you are. Apparently.
I just changed my Energizer Bunny batteries in my back. I'm ramped up and ready to roll.
Do we need to take like 5 minutes and meditate together?
We should. We probably should have contact Sam Harris and do some meditation.
Do some breathing exercises. I feel like I need it. Very excited for this conversation today. I think it's going to be different than anything that we've done previous, and that's always a good thing. I think that's why people tune into the podcast and like to hear who we have on as a guest and have a dialogue about ideas and art. And today, we're going to deep dive into different subjects that we probably haven't discussed. In fact, I know we haven't before. But we have a young artist on. She's joining us from Hamburg, Germany. She does a variety of work and works in different mediums, and I'll have her discuss her work in detail. Talya Feldman, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, especially with the time difference.
Yeah, so there's 8 hours time difference between Hamburg, where you're at in Germany, and Denver, Colorado. Or Mountain Standard Time, because Wes is in the same time zone.
Yes, he is.
Sorry. So why are you in Germany?
I am actually here. I'm getting my master's in Hamburg at the Hochschule for bildende Künste, which means the school for fine arts in Hamburg. And I actually came here initially on an exchange program for master's and decided to stay and transfer full time and continue my studies here and eventually finish my degree here. Yeah.
Gotcha. Right on. You're from Colorado though, correct?
Yeah. Born and raised. My great grandparents moved to Colorado. And so I have a long history of Coloradans in my family, and I would say probably majority of my family is still in Colorado.
So yeah. I got to ask, because we ask all our Colorado natives, do you sport the bumper sticker when you're back in Colorado or not?
Oh, yes. Not only the bumper sticker, but we also have the license plates, the special license plates for people who've been in Colorado for a certain amount of years, who can kind of have generations of Coloradans. So we're very proud of the license plates and the bumper stickers.
How many generations of Coloradans are you?
Well, now that I have a new niece as well. So with my new niece, the generations are 6 in my niece. Yeah, 6
That's
generations
pretty impressive.
of Coloradan. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Where did your great-great-grandparents come from?
They came from, at least on my father's side, they came initially from Russia. Yeah, and they actually came at the turn of the century, so in the early 1900s, fleeing from anti-Semitism in Russia.
So they're part of the famous group of Russian Germans. That were actually, Russian Germans, because there's a whole colonies of Russian Germans, and they're very proud of their heritage.
Yeah, certainly. It's funny because I don't really know if there's any German heritage on that side of the family. But of course, my last name when I came to Germany all the Germans say, "Oh, Feldman, you must be German." And then when I tell them, "Well, I don't know, my great grandparents came from Russia," then they respond like that. "Well, there are German Russians," and they kind of tell me that whole history, and then they're like, "So you're probably German."
Yeah. Well, and that's what I went off of. It's definitely more of a German name than it is a Russian name. So I jumped to that. But it's like it's a whole thing here in the United States of Russians that have German heritage fleeing Russia to come to the United States.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And on my mother's side, we're, I would say, 4 generations of Coloradan.
Nice.
About. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So do you have a history of artists in your family as well?
No, not that I know of. I would say probably the artistic, what I know of, my mom's cousin is a wildlife photographer in Colorado. Maybe you know her, actually, now that I think of it. Wendy Chattil. And she works, she had a long partnership with another photographer, Bob Brzezinski, for a long time. And they're based in Colorado. Also on that side of the family, I had a great uncle and great aunt that worked with galleries for some time and did a lot of prints with artists. Other than that, there's certainly been a lot of creativity. Music has been a big part of my family. Trying to think. Also, the great-great-grandparents that came from Russia, they were scribes, or my great-great-grandfather was a scribe. So he would do calligraphy in Hebrew for certain texts and ritual objects. So there's some, I guess, in that way, some artistry in that. But otherwise, I think I might be a bit of a black sheep.
How did you get involved with art and doing art? Were you always creative as a young child?
I was always creative, and I also went to the Denver School of the Arts for high school. So I would say that even moving towards high school, I was pretty involved with art and interested in art and exploring it further and what it means to be an artist and my place in that, really. And Denver School of the Arts was a great place to explore that, of course. And then from there, I went on to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for my undergraduate.
And what was your focus there?
My focus there was primarily painting, actually. Painting with some kind of explorations into multimedia, like fiber work and sculpture and animation as well. The nice thing about the school is that it's interdisciplinary. So you don't necessarily have to pick a certain department that you focus in. You can kind of move around. And I found that very helpful for me in exploring the ideas and the topics that I was interested in. But I stayed for the most part in the painting department. And that eventually is what led me to, afterwards, when I graduated, to New York. And in New York, I was working for some time at the Jewish Museum there as a curatorial assistant to this senior curator, Norman Kleeblatt. And that opened up a lot for me, that experience into the history that the Jewish Museum holds in terms of a lot of involving different artists over time, featuring artists even before they were so well known. I mean, if you look at some of the history of the Jewish Museum in New York, they were possibly one of the first museums to show Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, and they really were a leading museum in the 60s, and for really kind of pushing, you could say, the button in terms of art and movements. And I also, working with that curator, learned a great deal and worked with him closely on a few exhibitions there. One, a retrospective of the artist Mel Bachner. And when I left the Jewish Museum, I ended up working for Mel Bachner in his studio for a good number of years. And that was also a major learning curve in a very good way. I worked closely as his archivist. And so Mel Bachner is an artist who was very prominent in the 60s and is still prominent, and exploring a lot of his texts and a lot of his analysis of art and artists, and helping to archive a lot of the correspondence that he had with other artists at the time and now, like Sol LeWitt and Eva Hess and Robert Smithson, Donald Judd, all of those figures at the time, really opened for myself into art history, art theory, critically analyzing different fields of image making and different ways that you can conceptualize art. And then I decided afterwards to go back to school eventually. And now where I am now in Hamburg.
So how many years did you work with Mr. Bachner?
I worked with Bachner for 4.5 years, or close to 4.5 years. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Wow,
his artwork is really interesting.
Yes.
I like him.
Yes.
Lots of wordplay, or
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And his father was a sign painter, and a lot of his work, I think, does have a communication with that history, with his own past and his own family.
Yeah.
And this conversation about language was very interesting to me and opened a lot of doors for me, because at the time in my own work, I was really trying to find ways of exploring language visually and understanding what that means to explore language visually, which I think Bachner does very well. And so that was also when I first applied for my master's. I was very focused on what happens with words and the power of words, and what happens when words are abused or misappropriated, and how does that then affect different communities and different people.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of ways, that's also what pushed me to come to Germany in the first place, because I was looking further into that question, but also into image making in general. And what does it mean to use imagery that has a history of controversy, or that carries weight in different aspects? And a number of artists that I was looking at the time, a number primarily of Black American artists like Glenn Ligon and Kara Walker, who were taking, in a lot of ways, what it felt to me, taking back the power. So in some sense, they were appropriating racist imagery and language in a way that allowed them to then change the narrative, or that was the goal, was to change the narrative of that imagery to be in their hands. And of course, there's a lot of questions around that, a lot of controversy as well, where you have on one side, people saying, well, is that even possible? Like, can you do that? Can you take an image that has a history of hate and inciting hate and change it? I found that conversation very appealing. And I also found that working at the Jewish Museum allowed me to explore that as well, in that Norman Kleeblatt, the curator that I was working for, had done very similar exhibitions that were looking at anti-Semitic icons and imagery, and really investigating artists that take that imagery and and questioning, can they be successful in changing that narrative? He organized one exhibition around the Dreyfus Affair, and what that was looking at was in the early 1900s, there was, I don't know if you're familiar, but there was a captain in France by the name of Dreyfus, and he was accused of being a spy, and it came to light that he was not a spy, but he was being accused because he was Jewish. And when that kind of came to light, it in some ways divided the cultural world at the time. So it divided so many literary and artist figures that we know. Emile Zola wrote this really famous writing in defense of Dreyfus called J'accuse. And it really divided France in a way that I don't know that they had experienced. Maybe they had experienced it before, but it was very unique in that a lot of artists had to pick a side. Cézanne and Monet and Renoir and all of these figures that we know of at the time, they were either in the Dreyfusard camp or the anti-Dreyfusard camp. Also at that time, you had the printing press that was starting to allow for more dissemination of written material, but also of imagery. And I think it was in that time that we started to also see a lot of caricatures being made and disseminated. And that also began, in a way, the dissemination of anti-Semitic imagery in relation to Dreyfus, but also imagery that was debunking that anti-Semitic imagery and fighting it. So you had artists on both sides that were in some ways maybe capitalizing on the situation, but also in their own morals, picking a side. And at the same time, you had in the United States, of course, like Courier and Ives, which we know has a very strong history of racist imagery in depicting Black Americans in a very derogatory, demeaning way. And that also with the printing press was disseminated in a way that we hadn't had before. And so working with Norman, I was able to really explore that time and understand the imagery of that time. And then also, though, working with Norman, I was also introduced to another exhibition that he organized that was called Mirroring Evil. And what that exhibition attempted to do was bring artists from Germany, some Holocaust survivors, some the descendants of Nazis, and have them explore Nazi imagery in a way that hadn't really necessarily been explored before. So they were really pushing the button in a sense. They were taking Nazi imagery and appropriating it and putting it in a space and really trying to have a conversation about evil and what does that mean. And it was protested, the exhibition, and that I found very interesting as well in this conversation that I was also battling with. Again, like, can you succeed in debunking this imagery? Can you really, in using it and appropriating it and wanting to take back that power, can you, as an artist, do that? And that was what, in the end, really led me to Germany as a means of exploring, because I wanted to find a number of those artists who were a part of that exhibition and talk to them about their work, but also confront a lot of that imagery at the source and really investigate that within my own work. And that was, and that's kind of how I wound up here. And I found also at the school in Hamburg, my professor here, who is a major mentor and support for me in the work that I'm doing, was very helpful in kind of navigating, directing me towards certain other fields that can help me as an artist in my research, which I guess kind of maybe brings me to what it is that I do as an artist. So I work primarily in time-based media. So that's sound, video, but it can also be installation and sculpture. But a lot of my work is also in building collaborations and working with other people in fields that I am not an expert in. So reaching out to other researchers and activists and other artists in different fields like music and dance, and working with them to kind of understand this very complicated conversation and topic that I've been really fascinated by in a way. And for him, my professor, Simon Denny, he often would say to me, in a lot of ways, people and your relationships and what you're building with them is the material. So there's kind of this shift for me as an artist that it's not necessarily a tangible paint, but the material that I am working with in a lot of ways are these collaborations and are these relationships that I'm building with other people. And I find for myself in my work that it helps to strengthen it, and also helps me in approaching certain topics and fighting, which I'm sure we'll get to what I mean by that. But so that's a long-winded explanation of my journey to Germany.
So what school were you going to in the United States where you started your MFA? Because you talked about it being an exchange program. What school were you at when you did that?
So I was at a school in Boston at the time, and I should say that some of the professors there are incredible, but some were not. And I found myself dealing with a number of stereotypes and, I guess to be completely honest, there were some anti-Semitic ideologies that I was facing and having to battle, which I know is something that in any space you face. Certainly, I would imagine as a person of color or any other minority, there are times where you have to defend your right to be in a space. And that was something that I faced there, which on the one hand also helps you learn how to talk about your work and defend your work in a way, and yourself, really, because it's not necessarily an attack on your work, but it's an attack on you, and trying to find a way of fighting back and asserting yourself and keeping your feet planted and saying that not only do I deserve to be in this space, but I will not allow you to tell me that I cannot be. So that was another element that I think I was introduced to in Boston. And then when coming to Hamburg, I found myself in a completely different setting in a lot of ways because of the history that Germany has. I can certainly talk a lot about what all that means and what I mean by that, but that was kind of really what pushed me to stay. And I also found a path that I had never seen before in this relationship with my mentor, my professor, and the other artists that I was meeting, and the work that they were exploring and the topic that I was interested in.
Is there a difference between art education in the United States as studying abroad in Germany, in Hamburg?
Oh, completely.
Can you address that a little bit?
Yeah. Yes. It was a welcomed shock, actually, for me. I think in the U.S., our system in approaching art and art education is very structured. And in undergrad, certainly, and also when I was in Boston, you had a certain number of classes that you had to go to. You had to be there on time always. You had to go to every class. You had to fulfill whatever task that class had for you. And then in addition to that, you had to fill those classes in a certain amount of time, a certain number of years. And I think for undergrad, that was a good thing for me, that structure. But coming at it when I arrived in my master's program, I found that structure wasn't so helpful in that I wanted time to really focus on the work that I needed to do. And I wasn't necessarily able to do that in the structures that were built there. And for me, and again, I should say, everyone is different, of course. But for me, when I came to Germany and when I came to Hamburg and the school here, I was really, really pleasantly surprised because how they navigate it is you really apply to be with a particular professor. So you have this mentee-mentor relationship, and that professor accepts you into their class. And then you that's the class that you are a part of. And you don't necessarily have to go every time because they expect you, for the most part, to be working on your practice, to be out in the world, to be professional in what you're doing and in the connections that you're making. And they support you in that way. And the classes themselves are like, sometimes, my class will be once a week, sometimes once every 2 weeks, sometimes like not at all for a little bit. Sometimes it's from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Sometimes it's from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. So there's a lot of flexibility in how it's governed depending on the professor that you're with and the mentor that is helping you grow as an artist. And in addition to that, what I also found quite helpful was they have at the school here in Hamburg workshop directors and workshops, meaning that in addition to this mentor and this professor that you're working with, you also are encouraged to explore different materials and different mediums with people who that is their profession, is in that craft. So for instance, if I wanted to work in plastic, if I had an idea to work with plastics and I wasn't sure how to really materialize that because I don't have a background in plastic, I would then go to this workshop, to this plastic workshop, to the director, make an appointment, tell him what my idea is. And they, in their field, since that is their specialty, then come to me and say, okay, this is what we can do, and I will do it with you. So not only are you getting this professional help, but you're also getting that professional work in a way. So I think it teaches you a very valuable lesson of also in this conversation of reaching out and trusting people who are experts in their own field. It really supports that in teaching you how to do that, and in accepting that you don't need to know how to do everything yourself, because you can always reach out and find someone who knows how to do that, because that is what they do. And they are very happy to share that knowledge with you and help you actualize your ideas in a way that maybe even surpassed your initial plan. And I found that very exciting when I came here to Germany, and very helpful for my own practice.
In the American MFA program, I imagine it's usually 2 to 3 years to finish a MFA.
Right. Right.
Is it the same kind of thing in Germany as well?
Relatively, yes. Although they are, from what I've assessed, they're a little more lax, which is surprising because, sometimes you hear about the German system and they are not lax.
Right. Well, they're known very structured, time ordering.
Very structured. You get a letter about everything.
Right.
But at least in this sense, in this school, I should say, because not all schools work this way in Germany, but this school, I appreciated it because they are a little more open to working with you and saying, okay, if you're not, well, they expect you to be, of course, professional and to be working and to be really pushing it, but they will say, okay, 2-3 years, please, but I do know students who, because they are working professionals and because they also have families and they also are juggling other jobs, like they will take longer to get their degree, and that's okay, and that's accepted. And I found that also quite helpful in a lot of ways to see that you can do it all, in a sense. You can have a family, you can be working, you can be pursuing your degree in art, you can be using the resources that the school provides and the mentorship that the school provides, and keep doing, all the things that you want to do. So I found that very different from the system that I had been used to, and I welcomed it. So again, though, it's of course not for everyone, but for me, it was the right choice, the right decision to
Yeah.
make that move.
Yeah, it sounds very freeing and an awesome opportunity to work with experts in other fields and collaborate with them and help them with your work. That's awesome.
Really, it's much more self-directed. You got to have some discipline because of the way they go about it. And it sounds a lot more exploratory, which to me, when it comes to art, that seems like a more realistic model of learning. I love the fact that you're able to engage with a particular person that works in a specific medium you might be interested, maybe a medium outside of your knowledge base, and have somebody that, what's that? I'm sorry, and collaborate. Yeah, which was another part of what I was going to say is that which plays into this collaboration that you were kind of addressing earlier on, and how that actually is part of the whole process from what your professor and mentor has been kind of, I guess, working with you and instilling in you, correct?
Yes, very much so. It pushes you, it at least it pushes me to not be afraid of exploring new ideas and new materials, because I know that I can trust these people who know what they're doing and work with them, and that they are there and that they want to work with me, and that they are very open to trying new things as well. So that's also exciting.
So all of your professors and all these folks that are part of this program, they're all working artists themselves as well?
Yes. They are. The school itself is working to be more international. They have, in recent years, hired a number of professional artists who have been in their careers contributing to biennales and fairs and galleries and different fields and different worlds of art in different ways. And they have invited new professors from different countries to come to the school to help build a more international student base as well. So my professor is originally from New Zealand. Other professors are also from places like Scotland, the UK, the US, and in various other countries as well. So it's been really great to meet these other artists and to learn from them and gain a lot from their experience and their guidance. That's been a great asset to me, certainly.
You've had some really unique experiences leading up to this point, it sounds like.
Yeah. I have a lot of my work in the last year especially has been dealing with those experiences. So again, in some, perhaps you can say ironically, because of what led me to Germany in the first place, the topic that I was exploring was the history of anti-Semitic and racist language and imagery, and whether artists can appropriate that imagery and change it, and change the narrative, debunk those stereotypes, and looking at artists who have successfully done that and not so successfully done that, perhaps, and really questioning the ways in which that they have attempted and that they continue to attempt to do so. And very shortly after making the move to Germany, deciding to stay, deciding to officially live in Hamburg and pursue my master's here, I was also, I guess you could say, thrown perhaps into experiencing that hate very much firsthand. I am one of a good number of people who survived a right-wing extremist attack here in Germany that happened on October 9th in 2019 in Halle, Germany. And it was an attack on a synagogue in Halle, a local synagogue and a local kebab shop and also on a number of people who were on the street and also in another location outside of Halle called Wiedersdorf. And so there were many, many people affected by this attack, primarily targeted because they were either considered to be Jewish or Muslim or of refugee descent or Black or of a certain economic disposition or considered, or women. And that threw me into a lot of the research that I am doing now and a lot of the work that I'm doing now. In that, surviving an attack like that, I found myself asking a few questions. One being, how could this have happened? How could someone like that decide one day to go to a synagogue in a kebab shop and open fire like that? And in addition to that, another question, of course, was that followed, I should say, what can I do to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again? And for me, as an artist, I felt very lucky in that I had this outlet that I could use to navigate those questions in a way that I had never navigated them before. And I found myself, and I should say though that, again, this isn't for everyone. I think even in the experience that I had and even in the collaborations that I've done with other survivors, we all, even though we were all there on that day, we experienced it differently and we have been dealing with it differently. And I think every person navigates different traumas in their lives differently. And I find that very inspiring in a lot of ways in terms of thinking about the resilience that we as human beings carry in how we are able to keep moving despite what happens to us and despite what these outside, perhaps you could say, inside, outside forces of hate in this case, and how we kind of overcome those forces. And so for me, it was art and navigating it through that lens that helped me both process what I experienced, but also fight back and find ways of navigating and understanding the context as a way of fighting back. And so what I ended up doing with, in large part, the support of my professor, who, coming from New Zealand, recognized a connection between this attack that happened in Halle and the attack that happened not so much before in Christchurch, and also connecting it to other attacks that we know of in the United States, Poway, El Paso, Pittsburgh, all of these attacks that have been happening over the last few years, or even you could say even in the last 2 years, this rise of right-wing terror and white supremacy and violence that we've been witnessing is very connected. And I found that exploring those connections, understanding those connections, and then taking that information, that data, that research, and as an artist, visually analyzing and displaying it clearly for people would be an important way of helping us as a community, as a society, in understanding why these things are happening as a way of then stopping them from happening. So with information, in a way, we can then save lives. And I know that's perhaps a very lofty thing to say, but I say it because I have been looking a lot at the writings of Douglas Crimp, who was a very strong advocate during the AIDS crisis and after for visual language and visual information as a way of combating stigma and a way of combating a lot of the hate that was being directed towards LGBTQ people at the time during the AIDS crisis as a way of combating misinformation, which we, of course, are very familiar with right now. And he often says that for him, information is a way of saving lives. With the right information, with visually supplying information, we can save lives because we are more aware of where certain things are coming from, where certain ideas are coming from, and we can stop them before they become violent. And so for me, it was very important to not only, of course, really investigate those connections and that background and contextualize it and visualize it, but it was also important to me to focus on the people who are most impacted by this. And I found also with the collaborations that I began to build with other victims, other survivors of right-wing terror, not just in Halle, but beyond Halle, that was something that was even more powerful. I recently met a survivor of a right-wing terror attack here in Germany who survived an attack in 1992. And something that he said to me was, "We are stronger together. We are stronger and we are stronger together." And I found that focusing on that, in addition to, of course, providing this information and really emphasizing the importance of contextualizing these incidents, of understanding the connections, understanding the inspirations, understanding the radicalization that's involved online and what platforms and what tools, what networks, what recruitment tactics are happening within these right-wing and extremist circles. It was also even more so, you could say, important to focus on the voices of the survivors and the ways in which they were finding their own voice in moving forward and fighting back. And that took on many different forms for me, and it continues to take on many different forms for me. One project, like you mentioned, was the one that I did in Colorado that was in an exhibition organized by Odessa Nomadic, which is a collective, an artist collective in Colorado. And they they were very kind in opening this space and this platform to me. But what I did for that project was I went to a number of the other survivors, specifically from the synagogue, and I asked them to hum the prayers that they had been singing on that particular day. And I asked them to do that because I had been doing some research into trauma and the ways in which we heal from trauma. And I came across the book by Dr. Oliver Sacks called Musicophilia. And he talks about in Musicophilia this idea that music has a way of overcoming all other ailments, in a sense, that even Alzheimer's patients will remember when you play certain music that they recall from childhood or from adulthood or different moments in their lives. And he also spoke about the impact of humming as a way of soothing yourself, and that for especially trauma victims, humming is a way of soothing yourself, but also soothing those who hear the humming. So humming is both a soother for you, but also for those around you, which I found incredibly powerful, especially coming from these survivors, as a way for them to both soothe themselves, but also have a conversation and reach out to those beyond their experience. And especially showing that work in Colorado was particularly significant for me as, of course, a Coloradan, but knowing the history of mass shootings in Colorado and the healing that Colorado has had to do and that it continues to do with those scars from the mass shootings that we've experienced. So that was the work that I approached. And how it ended up being visualized, or the material aspect of it, was that each voice, so there were 10 voices in total, each voice was connected to an individual speaker, and the speakers were installed in the space. So as you walked through the space, you had a chance to stand in front of a speaker, which in my mind represented a person. And the speakers themselves were also embedded into the image of the triage form. So triage, oftentimes in moments of crisis, doctors and first responders will go into triage, and they will give you a color. They will often give you a color code so that they know who's more in need of attention right away versus others. And on the day of the attack, we received those forms as triage. And I learned that it's the same form used in Germany as in the United States, as in France. So it's a very international, global form, icon, you could say, and familiar. And I found that very powerful as well in bringing into that space, into that conversation with these voices and these people and what they experienced, but also in the way that they are reaching out to others who have also experienced certain similar violence and similar trauma, and are able to, with those scars, of course, continue to heal. So that was one work. And then in addition to that, I connected with a number of activists here in Germany, a number of researchers and others, when the trial began in Germany. So that was another big aspect, a big, I guess, moment, turning point, you could say, for my work, was being a co-plaintiff in the trial here in Germany against this extremist, this right-wing extremist, white supremacist. What I found was lacking, again, was this lack of information, lack of investigation within the media, but also within the court system itself, within law enforcement, within the investigation reports. And that was a deep concern to me, again, because if we cannot name the systems that allow these things to happen, then how are we ever going to prevent them from happening in the future? And so for me as an artist, I found that analyzing all of that information, again, looking at the context of this attack in relation to others, was incredibly important, both for myself, but also in taking back the narrative that was being, in a way, taken from us, the survivors, and making sure that we were controlling it in the way that we remembered it as the people who lived it. So what I ended up doing was reaching out again to my professor, a number of researchers that he knew in New Zealand who had been looking similarly, not just at Christchurch and the attack that happened there, but the long history of violence against Indigenous community in New Zealand, and how that context helps to understand how something like Christchurch could have happened. And they had been using at the time, so the researcher that I connected to, her name is Dr. Karamia Muller. And she had been working with this organization called Forensic Architecture. And Forensic Architecture is an organization based in London that focuses on human rights violations and does thorough investigations into them, and then kind of uses forensics architecture, animation, recreation, digital sound, all different media elements to help analyze and investigate in the ways that need to be investigated. So they offer an open source technology called the Time Map. And the Time Map what it allows you to do is input your own data into a web platform. So you build this kind of interactive web platform that's open to the public. You input your own data, and then you can see that data visually, both in time and space. So both on a timeline of events from dates and times, even exact times, to also where things happened cartographically, so where things happened on a map. And so for me, that was incredibly important tool in looking at this particular event, in that I could both track the online activity of this particular shooter in Halle, but also his offline activity, meaning the start of his attack to his final arrest. And I could also at the same time zoom out and connect this incident and this attack and these moments of internet activity, online activity, and offline activity with all of these other instances of violence that we were seeing happening at the same time, before and after, both in Germany, but also abroad, particularly in the United States, in New Zealand, in Oslo. And so I was able to, with the help of a number of other artists and researchers, so many, so many people, I was able to recreate what happened on the day based off of the witness reports and the witness reports of those who lived it, recreate what happened with 3D animation and narration. And I was also able to connect with a number of researchers in London and New York and elsewhere who could provide me with resources that would explain a lot of these connecting factors that shouldn't and couldn't be ignored. And in addition to that, I was also able to connect with an organization here, an activist network called NSU Watch. And they are the ones that are actually, you'll see in the web platform, they are the ones that are hosting the web platform. So the site itself is called halle.nsu-watch.info. And it's both in German and in English. And what it does is you go to the site and it opens up, it gives you an information video as to the purpose of this project, the purpose of this work. And it's meant to really, in a lot of ways, push people to start asking questions and to start asking questions in a way that then leads to accountability and then leads to action. And that accountability, both on the part of our law enforcement, on our justice systems, but also on the platforms and the figures that are participating and enabling that dissemination of hate that leads to this violence. And so that, I guess, again, a very long-winded explanation of the work that I'm doing, but that was a very big project that we're still, in a lot of ways, unfortunately, needing to update and to push forward. Because unfortunately, again, the media and the court system, even within the verdict of this case in Halle, were not willing to look at that context and to really point fingers at the systems that allow for this kind of hate to grow. And I think, too, we see that in the United States right now, of course, but those systems, as we also know, have been in place for a very long time. Hence, this our constant need for racial justice and for reform and for economic justice and all of these different movements that we have to continue fighting with and for. But yeah, so I think in a lot of ways it was meant to push people to really investigate further the way that I and others have from this attack had been doing, and to really pressure and to seek justice in the ways that we haven't been seeing justice so far. that was a big impetus and catalyst and future too for that project and for the work that I am continuing to do in relation to that.
Todd, I need to hold that question. Okay. I need to take a break. My mom keeps calling. I'm going to give my phone to my wife. So I'll be right back. Sorry.
It's such a complex subject.
Yeah.
If you just go to your website, it's hard. I think people can see if they spend enough time with the work on your website, they can kind of see where you're going and what you're doing. But having you explain it in more detailed form, it's much easier for people to wrap their heads around it. And having the historical context of your journey as an artist also, puts it in perspective as well. So everything that you said is completely, valid. It's not long-winded. It helps in the explanation of it, because it's a little bit, I don't know what the word I would use, not esoteric, but just it's just hard to wrap around the whole subject matter, and it's just so complex. I mean, with the links that you sent me in our prior dialogue that we had, I deep dived into a number of different subject matter via the internet. And it's way more complex than I knew.
It's a lot of rabbit holes.
A lot of rabbit holes. And so it's very hard to wrap your head around this whole subject. I mean, you really have to spend some time with it. This is a dialogue and a narrative that you continually have going on with yourself all the time, trying to interpret and suss out the details of what this means and where the work is going.
Yeah, exactly. It is. And it is also a question, okay, what's exactly like you said, okay, what now? What's next? Because it can go a lot of directions, because there are so many rabbit holes here. And there are so many topics that need to be grappled with and approached. And how do you do that in a way that doesn't, again, give that language or those images the power that they want? In that, how do you focus on white supremacy without giving these white supremacists a platform? I mean, it's a very complicated question. And I think as artists, certainly we deal with that. I think certainly artists like Carol Walker and Glenn Ligon deal with that. And also the artists that I had met in Germany deal with that, is how do you talk about something so complicated and so harmful and so hurtful, and not give it the power that it wants, not give it the platform that it wants. And it's a very complex question. I don't have an answer to it, but I, of course, am working in different ways of finding different ways of navigating that question and attempting to answer, but I don't know that I will ever have fully that answer. But I am at least trying. So that's a big part of it too, I think.
It's an exploration. It's exploration, and that's what art does, right? It's exploration of a particular subject matter, no matter if it's something that has to do with social justice, or whether it's just a landscape of a pretty, it's a pretty picture of something. You're investigating something as a human being. This whole journey that you've had and your experiences play into this experience. And so your explanation gives it context so that people can go, okay, I totally see where Talya's going with her work and the exploration. It's exciting. And you're thinking, because of where you're at with this MFA program and the structure of it and the people that you have mentoring you, it's pushing you completely out of the realm of what you've done previous as an artist.
Oh, completely. And in some ways, I am grateful for it. Grateful doesn't sound like a good word for it, but I think in some ways I am grateful for the art and for my ability to use it as a tool for both navigating these difficult topics that are both very personal to me and political, of course, and also helping me build my own strength myself as a person in the world trying to combat this evil and this hate, and also as a survivor, certainly, and trying to also use it as a way of building more connections with others who are also working to fight that hate in different ways. And I gain a lot of power from that and a lot of inspiration from that. And also to have had so many people involved with that particular project, with the time map, in itself was an incredibly healing process for me on a personal level, to know that there are so many people out there who are ready and able and who are really giving so much of themselves to fight this. And I think that is an important takeaway, in that, yes, this hate, this violence is incredibly overwhelming, but at the same time, there are many more good people than that. And there are many more people willing to fight and willing to stand up and call it out when they see it. I think we also, of course, in that sense, have a lot of work in that we need more people to do that, certainly, in different ways. But it is happening, and it can happen. And I think with the right information, people do act, and they will. So, yeah.
So it's empowering, this work that you're
Yeah.
doing. And it's
Yeah.
also work of hope and healing, right?
Certainly. Yeah.
And as I touched on, this whole subject is very complex. It's interesting. Well, I guess I want to circle back to something that you mentioned during the trial of this particular shooter, that with this incident that you were a part of, that the one thing that people that have suffered from these incidents, these hate crimes or what have you, the media always plays it as an isolated incident, right? And they never connect the dots between, you know, this history of what's been going on and continues to go on. Correct?
Precisely. And that is exactly what we were seeing here in Germany. And to be completely honest, it's exactly what we see happening in the United States when these incidents happen, that they are presented as what is called like a lone wolf, when in fact, they are not alone at all. And while these networks that are inspiring this hate are online and anonymous, they have a network of connections that are pushing for this violence, that are disseminating this hate, that are really want it to happen, that encourage it to happen, and are banking on the fact that they can push someone so far that one day they will pick up a gun and they will go and walk into a Walmart or a synagogue or a mosque. And I think what the important thing for me and for a lot of the others in this attack was to call out that myth in saying that this is not an isolated incident, not just looking at these online networks, but also at society, its place in it, and the hate that exists, the stereotypes, the racism, the anti-Semitism that exists within society itself, within the justice system, within law enforcement, and calling for people to really stand up and call that out when they see it. And unfortunately, we didn't see that happening. We didn't see it happen with the trial here in Germany. They didn't want to make it political. when in fact, as we know, the personal is very political. The political is personal, and so our work, our fight continues, but focusing more on those voices, on these voices, on the survivors, on the victims, on their families, on their fight, on their stories, I think is even more powerful and even more important than any of the other work that I've been doing in some ways, because we need to listen. We need to listen, and that, I think, is an important aspect of how I am approaching even my media with sound. Is how does sound play into the socio-political sphere? How does listening play into that? How does hearing, listening, speaking, humming, all of those things, with language, of course, again, going back to that, how can all of that play together to, like what we were saying before, empower and build upon the resilience that we have?
Here's my frustration about a lot of this, and when we're talking about hate groups, is the media, they have their part and they play their part. Their part is 7 minutes long, and they can only provide so much information in that short a period of time. And I don't think there's really a will to there. Now, obviously there's people like you and other documentarians that are willing to put more in-depth time in it. But the other thing that really frustrates me is, and we'll point back to January 6th of this year when they stormed the Capitol. I've talked to a number of people here, and even though they carried the banners of President Trump into the building and definitely was trying to isolate specific senators and representatives, when I talk to specific people in South Dakota, they continually point that, oh, this wasn't Trump supporters, these were Antifa. And Antifa is just trying to embarrass President Trump. And that's how you do it, is you carry their banner. So the fact that, the right, not even the extreme right, but the right political leaning people in South Dakota and probably in other states they totally dismiss the fact that these are far right extremists. They won't even accept that. They'll say, well, no, these are anti-Tifa people who at the same time has the same agenda. I don't care what political realm you're on. When you're an extremist, whether you're a far left or a far right, it's the same agenda, and that's disruption. And that's what they're trying to do. But when the moderately left leaning or the moderately right leaning won't always point the finger at the other people, we don't gain anything. And I just talked to somebody on yesterday, the same thing. He said this exact same thing. It was all Antifa. It wasn't the Trump supporters. So what do you do with that? I mean, and that's part of the problem with pointing the finger. Unless you have an extremist that, let's say the church in South Carolina that was attacked by that young gentleman, that can clearly be stated that was a racial act, and he was acting out on a racial, and
completely.
Yeah. So anyway, that's my frustration with this whole, not this discussion, but the discussion about whose fault it is, because a lot of times they'll just point at the other side. And, well, really, he was the other side, So anyway, that was just a side note here.
No, I mean, I think it's a valid frustration, because how do you have a conversation if people are not willing to acknowledge their part in racism, in anti-Semitism, in any of that hate? And I say that even as myself. In this fight against hate, you also have to take a step back and recognize the stereotypes that you yourself might carry, and work to debunk that and question that. And I think with what happened at the Capitol, it, of course, was a shock, but it was not a surprise, in that we knew at least a number of the platforms that I follow, that I often look to for support and research, and a lot of the researchers that I've been working with, many of those platforms like the Anti-Defamation League, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London, Data and Society in New York, they knew that on these online platforms that a lot of these right-wing, far-right extremists use, they were calling for violence. They had plans. They knew what they were doing. They were recruiting people to go to that rally and then push forward and commit the act of violence that they did. So I think a lot of it too is also, and again, zooming out and looking at the context, how that is so important again, because if you look at who it was that was involved with inciting that violence online, a lot of them are the same players that were involved in the rally in Charlottesville. And the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, as we know, also led to violence and the loss of life. And it's important to make that connection, because when you do, you also see that after Charlottesville, there was also this slew of misinformation also blaming Antifa. And I think that when you start to notice those patterns, and when you can kind of see who are the players, what is their agenda really, I think at the same time, for what happened at the Capitol, and again, I'm not an expert in this, but I don't believe that everyone who was there on that day was there with the intention to pursue violence. I don't think that's true. The problem is that you have players who know very well what they're doing and what they're inciting and how they're able to incite it, both psychologically, again, the language and the imagery that they're using, to push people to that point. That was what they were banking on, and that's what we saw happen. Because again, it just takes one person. How it's done and the platforms that are used and what they are banking on is that for a lot of these far-right extremists and these white supremacists, it doesn't matter to them how many people are killed, just as long as more people are going out and committing these acts of violence. And if they can continue to inspire more and more and more, which is what we're seeing happening, then they feel like they did a job well done. And I think even in what happened at the Capitol, the danger there too is you have an instance where they can then say, we succeeded in our mission. We said we would storm the Capitol, and we did. Conspiracies and this violence is not necessarily going to go away anytime soon. Unfortunately, these conspiracies, this imagery has been there for a very, very, very long time, and it's just now we are seeing it permeating online. But this is, we've seen it before, and we know where it leads. We know very well where it leads. For me, when I was watching what was happening on January 6th, I was mainly paying attention to not the extremists, but how mainstream media was talking about them in the language that they were using and the information that they were giving. Because I think that in particular, when we're talking about the moderate and how do we understand the context, how do we make sense of it, how do we zoom out, how do we know how to move forward, like you were saying, does fall very heavily on our media, also on the imagery that's being produced, also on the language. And so I was paying very close attention to who was calling this an insurrection, who was not, who was calling certain of these people white supremacists, who was not, who was recognizing the connection to Charlottesville, who was not. And I think also it's important to have leadership in positions that are willing to also call it what it is and say, this is white supremacy and this is not acceptable. This will not be tolerated. And the truth of the matter is, even if we were to just eliminate the internet, these groups would still exist. They still existed before the internet. They'll still exist after the internet. But what we can do is ensure that there is not a platform for this hate, that it's not tolerated in our communities, that it's not accepted. And I think, again, that for me, at least as an artist, I think that is like a very much a call to arms in a sense. Perhaps that's not a good phrase, but it's, how do we fight that? That there is no space for that kind of hate, that language, that imagery in our communities and in our society and on the internet. We fight it back with imagery and language, and that for me has been definitely something I've been thinking a lot about, and the different ways that can happen.
Yeah, the difficulty with trying to attack any kind of hate speech is it's protected speech. In the United States, it's protected by the Constitution. You cannot limit hate speech. And this, based on the government, cannot limit hate speech. Now, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, any of those can, because they're a private company. They can delete any kind of hate speech. They have that power. Right. But as far as the government and Germany, I would imagine, I've heard, and I'm obviously not an expert in German politics or anything, but they come from a little bit, especially West Germany, came from a different perspective of Nazism. Was like, no, we're not tolerating any. East Germany had a different experience because it was controlled by the Russians, and the Soviet Union at that time. And so it has a different take, or had a different take. Now, I don't know about the unification of Germany, if it's changed that dynamic or not.
Right.
But, so it's a little different than in the United States, where hate speech, Charlottesville, completely acceptable up to the violence, marching, right? And the only thing the government can do is time, place, and manner. You can protest here at this time, at this place, and in this manner. And if they're not willing to stick to the guns of what the time, place, and manner, then we have Charlottesville, the torches at night, which I thought was optically was really reminiscent of the rise of the Nazi Party. And the night of broken glass, is the next step, right?
Yeah. And I think you're right in that we have to be it is a very fine line between freedom of speech and the regulation of speech. And again, I think also in this conversation of Twitter and Facebook and Telegram and all of these, and just the more mainstream ones, because there are a lot of fringe sites that are not regulating at all, and certainly they profit a lot off of the hate that's disseminated on their platforms. But I think in that sense, it's important to continue having that conversation of ethics involved with the regulation of speech online and offline, but also paying attention to when that speech turns into violent action. What I do try to think about is how is that language being used? How is it then being disseminated? So for one, if it's being used in the context that we've been seeing offline, then, like you said, we can't, you have a right to protest, you can do that. We, for instance, saw that, I can't remember what year, but in Chicago, and there was a neighborhood of Holocaust survivors, and the KKK wanted to do a march through that neighborhood. And that was a big question, is can they be stopped from doing that? And the answer was, well, no, because it's freedom of speech, they have the right to protest, to do that march. But for me, what I pay attention to is how is that language permeating into more moderate discourse? And I think for me, that's when it becomes more alarming, is when that language starts to be tolerated, and when that language starts to be desensitized, or that imagery becomes desensitized. And all of a sudden, you have politicians and even presidents saying certain things about minorities, and no one is questioning them on that. And I think that is of concern to me, because then you get to a point where people are completely dehumanized or demonized, to the point that we do see what happened in Germany, if that makes sense. And I don't know that that's necessarily an answer, but I think it's just, for me, it's just a matter of really closely paying attention to, again, where is this language coming from? Who's saying it? Why are they saying it? And what are the tactics they're using to disseminate it? Like, I think, for instance, with the online platforms, the hashtags and the conspiracies that are able to be disseminated through hashtags and through all of these different avenues, that concerns me, certainly, because then you all of a sudden have people using those hashtags that may not know what those hashtags mean, or they might not know where that conspiracy is necessarily coming from, but because someone they somewhat respect used it, then they start using it. And I think that is when we run into more trouble. Not to limit speech, but to certainly question it, I think, is important. And to investigate it always is important.
And we have a lot more ways to communicate than we ever have before.
Certainly.
And the evolution of this language is constantly changing.
Mm-hmm.
I have two children. They know what's going on more so than me as a 51-year-old man, right? And they're constantly educating me on new words. They'll say something, I'm like, what does that mean? And they explain it to me like, that doesn't even make sense to me, but okay. But it makes sense to a whole demographic of people out there.
Right.
And in deep diving into the subject matter, I realized that there's a whole vocabulary that is utilized by these hate groups.
Certainly.
And like you said, when it becomes mainstream and it's not called out by people, either in our government or people of power, I guess, or in a powerful position, when it's allowed to just continue to fester and proliferate, then it becomes part of the mainstream culture. And that's when it becomes dangerous. That's where society comes into play, right? And we're seeing that in what happened after January 6th with the pushback from people going, all right, this is it. We've had enough. It wasn't surprising what happened by any stretch of the imagination. And in some ways, I feel like that instance, it had to come to a head at some point. There's always like this turning point, right? Where people go, okay, that's it. I've had enough. Yeah. Now, we're all filled up of this craziness and the hate. Yeah. Now we're going to do something about it. And so we've seen some movement. The needle has been moved a little bit. I don't know if that will continue, but at least it was, I think people felt like, okay, now something's happening. But at the same time, we're very complacent. I don't know how it is in Germany, but I feel like, Americans in general are pretty complacent. As long as it doesn't directly affect you or your livelihood or any way, shape, or form, then it's like, that's somebody else's problem. I don't want to have to think about that or deal with that. I know it's bad, but I'm not going to do anything about it, right? I'll go online and scream, oh, this is terrible. But, and this is why I don't engage with people online. I don't think I'm changing anybody's narrative or opinion by wading in the murky waters of political debate online. It always ends up being a bunch of name calling and pissed off people, right? What needs to happen is people actually engaging with each other and having some kind of dialogue like we're having right now. Your work, certainly, I think, is really important because you're dealing with the subject, you're exploring it. And that's what people need to realize when they're looking at the work. It may be, and I'm going to defer to you on this, but is it difficult for people to wrap their heads around what you're doing at times?
Well, I think because it's such a difficult topic, and like you were saying, it's hard for people to engage, to understand. If it doesn't affect them, then it's hard to then approach it or to understand it. Like, I think what I find empowering in art and the ability of sound and media and even painting is that there's a new language that's built that's able to connect and reach an audience that wouldn't have otherwise been reached. And I think for me, I am trying to find ways of doing that, certainly, of finding a common ground that allows for people who may never experience right-wing terror because they are not a minority or because they, well, for whatever reason, but they can at least feel the pain of what that experience is, or they can at least connect to it on another human level of pain or of compassion or of resilience or of trauma even, or of hardship or of what are all of these other basic, not basic, but things that we as human beings all face in life. And finding those kind of avenues of reaching someone is what I am attempting to do in the work. And sometimes it's more successful than other times, certainly. But I also believe that if you can find that common ground with someone, if you can not say that you understand what they're going through, but that you can at least recognize that they are going through something, I think that in itself is a powerful thing to say. And that is what's necessary from society today. And I think for me also in Germany too, I think it's very much the same as what we're seeing in the United States, is that it can't just be coming from minorities. It can't just be coming from survivors of these attacks and the people most affected by this hate, because it won't change if it's just coming from us. It has to be from all of us. And every person needs to put their foot down in saying and calling these things out when they see them. Because otherwise, like we're saying, it becomes tolerated, it becomes mainstream, you just stop questioning it, it becomes status quo. And we don't want that. We certainly don't want that.
You can't be on the fence, right?
Exactly.
If you disagree with it, then you have to call it out. However, whatever that looks like, you can be an artist, you could do it in your music, you can do it as a person that writes poetry, or you can just be the regular average Joe with a 9-to-5 job that around the water cooler, there's a joke told and you're like, hey, that's not right.
Exactly.
Accountability. That's the other thing that we suffer from. A lack of accountability in modern day society. It's always pointing the finger. Well, this is because of this, and we don't deep dive into things. So it's always very topical. Everybody wants this like pretty little package that they can just, disseminate that in like 3 seconds, right? They don't want to have a long dialogue with somebody over, a subject that might be uncomfortable.
Yeah. And it is uncomfortable and it's not easy and it's very, very hard. But it's necessary. I think we can learn a lot from a lot of different activists over time, and a lot of different leaders who have taken up that cause and who constantly are pushing for more moderates to be outspoken, and more people who don't think that this affects them to realize that it does affect them. And maybe not in the same ways that it affects their neighbor, but it certainly affects them. I know it was just like recently MLK Day, and I have been looking at a lot of his speeches, particularly towards the end of his life. And one of the last sermons he gave before Christmas, he does say, we must love one another or perish together as fools. And I hope I'm not taking I apologize if I'm taking MLK's words out of context. I really hope I'm not. But that did strike me as very true and very necessary and very urgently necessary for us to recognize.
Absolutely. I guess when I started, like at the beginning of this, and I said, is it hard for people to wrap their heads around your work? It's not so much the context of it or the content of it, what you're addressing. I think it's more because it's not your typical, what people in their minds think of as far as art, right? It's
Right.
like, and I guess that's where I was going with that question is that it's, I should have addressed that or asked that question in a different way. But so I wanted to circle back to that because of the way it's presented. If you spend time with it, I think you get it, and obviously you talking about it is really important for people to more easily understand, because it's not something where you just go to a museum and you're looking at a particular piece, you stand there for a bit of time and disseminate what you think it means or what have you. It's a little bit different than that. It's still art, but you're thinking outside the box and you're thinking in means of communication, which looking at your art and talking with you, you've pushed me. I mean, it makes sense that, okay, this isn't just another form of art, right? We don't really we look at poetry as art, but it's not something tangible that you can touch. It's an idea, right? And that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with different modes of communication to convey a message, but not necessarily like it's not a painting or a photograph or anything like that you can easily go, oh, that's art, right?
What's the medium that you operate in? Maybe that's a good place to start. Is it digital? Is it installation art? How would you describe your art in what you're currently working on?
Sure. You might not like this response, but I would say all of the above. And I say you might not like it because it might not be clarifying when I say that. I don't necessarily limit my medium. I will do whatever I need to do to get a message or concept across that I need to. And sometimes that comes in the form of an interactive web platform. Sometimes that's in sound, in speakers, but also in imagery. Right now I am working on a project that is involving screen prints and text. And so I am very interested in finding ways of communicating these messages and these voices in whatever form that I can. In some ways, it's like I can't limit myself because, like, I can't limit the voice in a way. Like, I don't want to limit the voice. And so whatever form that voice takes, I'm willing to pursue it if I feel like it can reach people in a way that they may not have otherwise been reached before. And certainly that can be difficult, especially if you're expecting or if you're more used to approaching a painting. Not to say that a painting can't be powerful in communicating certain message in its own right. And who knows, maybe I will do some painting at some point that relates to some of these topics. But for me, it's I'm looking for all of these areas of communication and trying to use them or pull from them in whatever way I can. Again, I guess in thinking about sound in particular, for instance, I think sound for me in a lot of ways has a way of reaching people more immediately than other modes that I've used before, and more emotionally even. Like when you hear someone humming and then you know that person experienced such a trauma, and then at the same time you know that humming is a way for them to become empowered and to heal, and also a way for them to communicate with you and want you to heal from trauma. Like that, I think, is a very powerful connection that can happen, and one that I like to explore and push in a way.
Yeah, I totally get that. So like the one piece you did in Colorado, with the speakers and the humming, that's obviously installation art. The piece that's called Eulogy, was that more of a film, right? More of a...
Yes.
Can you talk about Eulogy just briefly?
Sure. So Eulogy was another kind of exploration into sound, into language, into voice, but also approaching a completely different art, which is dance and movement. And I found that what I was exploring in that moment of thinking of Eulogy, I was trying to find a way of communicating something without language. How do you communicate to someone again? How do you reach someone who doesn't understand or may not even be willing to understand the experience that you have, and get them to meet you in common ground, or to feel what you're feeling in whatever way that is, and accept it, and then want to then act upon it. So Eulogy was a collection of voices of survivors from right-wing terror. And I had gone through a number of statements and testimonies, and I kind of collected all of the words that were very similar, that were being repeated in a lot of those testimonies and statements. I looked through, I want to say, over 20 of them. And it was from this particular attack in Halle that I was pulling from. And I then composed them all into a kind of found language poem. And I reached out to a number of people around the world who experienced discrimination in different ways, in their own ways, as Black people, as women, as Muslims. And I asked them if they would be willing to record themselves reading the poem in whatever way they felt it. And they all came at it in their own way, from their own experience, which I think as humans we tend to do. I think we come at art also in that. You come at art, when you're looking at something, when you're experiencing something, you're also bringing all of your experiences before, everything that you are as a person and what you understand of the world, and how you experience a work is how you experience, how you also are in that moment of your life, I think. Which is why I think also you might come at a work differently at different points in your life, because you yourself are different in a different place, which is quite magical when you think about it. But so in a way, I asked them to approach the work in their own way, in their own space, and in their own experience, and then compiled those voices together into a sound piece. And at that point, I felt like what I wanted to do was also find a way of communicating without language. How do you communicate to someone how you feel if there is a language barrier there? And at that point, I was thinking a lot about body and movement, and how dance in particular, how movement can communicate something like that. And so I approached a dancer here in Hamburg, and I asked if she would be willing to collaborate with me on this work, and if she would be willing to kind of, in a lot of ways, embody these voices. She was very an amazing person to work with, very generous with her time and her skill and her work. So we made this film together, with her creating movement to embody these words that were said by these survivors, but spoken by people around the world who experienced discrimination in different forms and in the same form as well. And so there were a lot of layers to that work that I was trying to pull together. And that was kind of the result of it.
Eulogy on the front page of your website, that's just the segment of it, right? It's not the whole thing.
Correct.
Is there a place where a person can go to experience the whole thing, or is that not out there? Okay.
Yes, it is. I at the moment I have a password on it, but I actually am going to take away that password.
Okay.
And release it. At the moment it's on Vimeo, but I'm going to actually remove the password this week and put it on my website as well, so you can see the full.
I love the piece. It's like Martha Graham meets, you know who Martha Graham is, right? The modern dancer. Yeah.
Yes.
So, I'm a speech comm major. My undergrad was in speech comm. So a lot of that is nonverbal communication and how we communicate nonverbally. And that makes up a large portion of how we communicate, and people don't think about it. I do like the piece. I love the idea of motion and connecting it to sound. I really want to see the whole piece though. And so I'm glad to hear that you're going to release it without a password where we can go and watch it. Amanda Gorman, who did the poet, she's was a youth poet laureate who did poetry, can move me in ways that a lot of times visual arts can't. The use of language is always very appealing to me, and she did a phenomenal job. And so this whole idea of sound is the same thing. Sounds can connect us to a moment in the past, whether it's music or it's just one of those senses that can immediately push you back to your childhood or whatever. So I like these ideas. I was, when I first went to your website, I was just trying to wrap my head, because we're so, we've been focused so hard on visual arts, and I want that easy description, like, oh, I'm an installation artist or whatever. And it's hard to wrap your head around your work because it comes about it in a different way that I'm not used to. And I'll be honest, installation art, whether you're talking about Weiwei or Christo, Damien Hirst, and all those, right? They're hard for me to wrap my head around, because it's just like abstract expressionism. It's something that's emotional, but it's not something you can look at and take a literal description of. Todd knows I've gone from being a critic of abstract expression into really, I would like, yay, let's go look at some abstract expression art, right? Because I've now kind of understand what you have to do to wrap your head around it. You got to sit with it. You got to look at it. You got to feel some emotion, try to figure out what the artist was trying to speak, and what's speaking to yourself. And so installation art is very much the same way. If you wrap a building in some kind of plastic, what am I supposed to emote from that? And speaking of Christo, right? And it's fun to see this, but I had a hard time wrapping my head around it. So. Yeah,
no, I appreciate the honesty.
And it's not a gig. Don't tell. I'm not being critical. I'm just like, it was.
No, to be honest, most of my family would say the same thing. And my family is like, what is it that you do? I don't understand it. And this is different. And, which is completely fair. And I think and I appreciate it too, because it's honest and it's true. And it does push you to think about what art can be. And it's also okay to say that you don't like it. I mean, that I think is also what's powerful about art and how you define it, is that it's all relative. And, for installation in a lot of ways, and of course there are a lot of different art critics and theorists that talk about installation and what that means and what can be considered an installation. But for me, it is a lot about the experience that you have as yourself in viewing that work and being in that space with that work. And again, I think a lot of that, what plays into that, is where you are as a person in your own life and what experiences and what knowledge you're bringing, or what thoughts you're bringing to it. Like what you were saying, your own background with language, that's incredibly significant. And I'm glad to hear it, because you're bringing something that I also maybe didn't even think of before, and you're coming at it, or you're able to look at the work or experience the work in a different way than someone else, for instance. And it doesn't mean that that experience is more valid than another's experience. In even saying you don't like it doesn't mean that that is not a valid thing to say. I think it's very valid to say, and I think it's a good thing to say. But yeah, so I do appreciate that, and I agree. Yeah, it's different than perhaps most of us consider art or approach art or know about art. But I find that very exciting, and I find there's like this, perhaps you could argue with me whether this relates or not, but there's a very famous story about Robert Rauschenberg, where he was commissioned by this very rich woman to do a portrait of her. And he ended up sending her a blank page, and she gets very angry and she says, "This isn't a portrait. How can you send this to me?" And his response was, "This is a portrait if I say it is." And so it kind of brings into question, like, this is art if I say it's art. And you can really fight that, of course, and a lot of people have over time. But I do think about that a lot, in that we can look at a lot of things as art, we can consider a lot of things of art, and we can consider a lot of things not as art. But again, it's very relative, and it's very valid in whatever way you take it.
Go to Talya's website. It's talyafeldman.net. So it's TALYAFELDMAN.net. Talk about the whole series After 1 Year.
That I did actually in collaboration with a number of other survivors. I did a series of interviews with them after 1 year. So on the 1 year anniversary of the attack. It was an important thing for me to do. I hope it was also something that I could do for them in giving a platform in a way to their voices. And they were published online on social media on the 1 year anniversary of the attack. And a lot of the questions that I asked them were also questions that I was asking myself. Mainly, what do you want society to know? What has helped you get through this past year? What are you hoping from the trial? Because at that point, the trial was still ongoing. It no longer is. And that was the project. And it was also pretty empowering to also then put those voices online, especially in this conversation that we're having, where a lot of the voices of hate are also coming up online. We can also put a lot of voices of solidarity and resilience online. And I think combating it like that was an important thing for me, and a big part of why I approached a lot of different social media networks I shouldn't say networks, but activist networks on social media to promote these videos as well.
And then as you scroll down, you come to, and you mentioned this project before, the Global White Supremacist Terror, Allah. Talk about
Yes.
that particular piece. If you have a YouTube link that describes what it's about, which is really great, but kind of describe a little bit more in detail how that came about and how you disseminate this information.
Yeah. So that is the project that I did with NSU Watch and a number of other researchers and activist networks in Germany and also abroad. And it has been, in a lot of ways, it was our attempt at, and I would say we have been successful in our own ways of combating the narrative that was being formulated by the media and by the courtroom and even by the investigators of the case, that this was a lone attack, that there was no other influencer, that all we have to do is put this person in jail and that's it. Our job is done. When in fact, this person, this shooter, this terrorist, he is a symptom of a much greater far-right white supremacist ideology that's permeating our world. And not recognizing that felt very dangerous. And so that was the purpose of the project, was to really zoom out and zoom in and really look at all of those connections and all of those networks of hate and how they are using the internet and how they motivate people like the shooter in Halle to do what he did, and how he then is inspired and his goal is to inspire others. So that was the project, the interactive web platform that I did with these other networks and other people.
And then last but not least, and there's some other work that you can see if Talya is on her website, but discuss this collaboration that you did that's called Together Apart.
Yes, that was in Colorado. So at the start of the pandemic, I was actually in Colorado in March. And a very close friend of mine, Zoe Aqua, who also is from Denver, and also we knew each other at Denver School of the Arts. So we went to high school together. And we were very good friends. We are very good friends. And we lived and worked together also in New York. And she was also home at that time. And we decided that we wanted to do a project together that would be something for the neighborhood, that would be an art installation performance that we could give despite the coronavirus to the people who are around us. And luckily also for me at the time, she was working already in collaboration with a musician in Hungary. And they had already started to delve into the archive of two musicians who did the same, in a way, the same thing that we were trying to do. They would travel and perform for their local community and their neighbor and small towns and neighborhoods and moments of joy, but also moments of sadness. And their life's work had never really been transcribed. And so what Zoe and this other musician were doing was they were working together actually this other musician had already been working to transcribe this music and archive it and solidify it in a way, this memory of these two musicians and their life's work. And Zoe was working with him on playing that music and learning how to play that music that they performed. And we thought that it would be a very powerful work to have them both play one of those melodies together, but apart, considering coronavirus, considering the different countries that they're in. And they performed separately, but then were brought together in this work. And so we projected both Zoe and this other musician, Attila, on the large windows of a house in Denver in a small neighborhood. And we just played. So, and it was lovely. I mean, I guess that's maybe the best word I could use. But there was, of course, a lot of power in it, but it was also it was something that we wanted to give to the community and to the neighborhood, and just to bring up people's spirits in a way in this time of uncertainty. And I felt also that these musicians would very much approve of that, considering what they did for their life as well.
That's wonderful. So I got to ask you this. You are on this path, and I believe in what you're doing. I think it's amazing work. Speaking for myself, how far are you in your MFA program? And then when you leave here, and obviously this is an exploration of this work, do you see yourself continuing to do this work once you have your degree?
I do, certainly. I think that I will continue to, in a lot of ways, continue what I had even started before this year, before the attack, in exploring how can you investigate this language, this imagery, and work to debunk and to fight against it. At the moment, of course, I'm looking at a lot of how that is permeating online. But I also find that building connections with other survivors of right-wing terror has also allowed me to find and navigate and think of different ways that I can do that, empower those voices and a lot of the other people that I'm meeting along this journey. So I do see myself continuing that very much so in different medias. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see what it might actualize itself as next, but could be anything.
So then the question I have, and this I think I'm interested in this for other artists that might be pursuing work that is not easily, say, monetized. And because we have to talk about the fact that you need to, in order to do this work, you need to have money to do it, and you have to support yourself, right? So how does an artist that is doing this kind of work, this vein, exploring this type of stuff, how do they support themselves? What avenues are available to you as an artist that doesn't do traditional type art, that people can walk into a gallery and purchase? How do you support yourself doing this?
A lot of different ways. I think that there are a lot of different ways. I mean, I think you've touched on this in your podcast before, that there's no set path for how to be an artist or even to determine what that means, being an artist. And for me, what has been working is that I apply for a lot of grants, a lot of grants. And I also really, in building collaborations and working with others, I'm able to then find ways of communicating or working together with them, and also being paid essentially to do a lot of the work with them in collaboration. And so I find that I can navigate certain other fields and then make myself valuable, of course, as an artist that can visually analyze certain things, and then still work within the data collection and the concepts and the activism that I am, while also working alongside people who can give me even more in a way that can help me build upon those ideas and those concepts because of where they're coming from and what they know. And I find that also very exciting to work with people who are not artists, and find different ways of working together that benefit both of us, or all of us in a way. So that has certainly been helpful to me in supporting myself. And I also, though, I always think of this as well. In undergrad in Chicago, I had a painting professor who was an amazing painter. And I learned so much from him. And something he would always say is he was very gruff because he also was in the military for a long time. And he would always call us by our last names. And he would say things like, "Feldman, like when you get out of here, you're going to have to find a way of supporting yourself." He's like, "But I don't care what you do. You like be a bartender, be a, I don't know, like pack boxes. It doesn't matter. Just as long as you find time to paint." And I think that's a very valuable thing to think about, because, as long as you are able to find time to work in the way that you want to work as an artist, paying the bills, maybe this isn't the best thing to say, but you figure it out. I mean, like, you do what you need to do in a sense. And certainly there are artists that get to a point where they can support themselves 100% on the work that they're doing. And certainly there are artists that support themselves in other ways. Like in the collaborations that I've been kind of focusing on in grants and residencies, and I've seen artists also of course, like in teaching, or being teaching artists. But I think also I've seen artists who are able to make themselves an asset to a field that wouldn't otherwise think of hiring someone like them. Like I've seen artists go into spaces and even into, I'll give you an example. So it's a very famous artist, also from Denver, Meryl Euclides, and she did an incredible, her life's work is quite incredible. But one project, that residency, I should say, that she did was with the New York Department of Sanitation. And she convinced them to give her that residency. And I can't remember how long it was that she maintained that residency, but she did a lot of work with the Department of Sanitation. One work that was very significant was where she, as a performance, went and shook the hands of every worker within that department. And she made a point of shaking every person's hand that worked for the Department of Sanitation for the state of New York. And she also did another work where she put mirrors on the collection trucks, on the trash collection trucks, and had it kind of reflecting back at the city. And so there's a lot of conversation that you can have around that work that's incredibly powerful. And there is a lot of power in the reasons why she was doing it, especially in the time that she was doing it, as a woman, as a feminist, as a performance artist, as a eco-feminist, in thinking about also just human dignity. And for her also at that time, there's a conversation about her as a mother and how she felt the need to shake every person's hand because she, as a mother and as an artist, was not getting the recognition that she knew she deserved. And she wanted to make a point of also of showing the respect that she wished she had to those who are also not getting that respect and that dignity that they deserve for keeping the city clean. And so that was, I mean, of course, again, there's a lot of conversation you can have about her work, and that's definitely worth having because it's powerful. I think in that sense too, when you think about being an artist and where you fit and what you can do, sometimes it's exciting to insert yourself in places that may not have considered you before, and then make them consider you. And not just consider you, but then embrace you. That I certainly also promote in a way. If you can do it, do it.
Thank you for addressing that, because I think it's important that people that are doing work, whatever it may be, to not be deterred by, not having a traditional path. And artists are good about thinking outside the box, and they're very resourceful. And I'm glad you answered that question and said, hey, there's other ways to go about it. And there are. And so thank you very much for answering that question.
I always like it when people name drop, because I've never heard of her and I just looked her up and some interesting stuff. So I'll be doing a deep dive on her, I'm sure. But I always appreciate that, because obviously this is a learning experience for both of us. And a lot of it is, I would have never probably ever ran across her stuff. So I appreciate that. That's a great question that Todd asked, is because there's people that want to get into art, and sometimes, I'll just be like, I'm 59 and I'm a dad. I'd be like, well, what are you going to do with your art degree? After you get your degree? I don't see how this is applicable to the modern society, and so it's nice to see that there's answers to this. Just because you're an artist and you're not, selling a piece of art for $125,000, that's all right. You're tapping into your creative self, or you're paying your bills through another form of income. Who cares? Your professor was right on. I don't care what you do as long as you produce, right? Produce beautiful work in whatever form that is, whether it's digital or whether it's painting, sculpture, installation art. I think that's wonderful. So, and I think the work you're doing is good. And I hope, because you made reference like I didn't like it, and I hope you didn't feel that. Okay. And I think it's fine that people don't like anybody's art. That's fine too. My dad definitely wouldn't understand half the art we've talked about through this course of a year and a half. So yeah, so I appreciate your art. I'm glad that, we had this discussion, because it helps me wrap my head around what you're doing, why you're doing it. And that just helps me really start to appreciate not only your art, but, art of other people. So anyway, whatever that was worth.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that.
Talya, I got one more question, then we'll sign off here. But I'm just kind of curious. At the beginning of this discussion, we talked about your exploration and educating yourself about different groups that were taking language that was considered inappropriate, offensive, that sort of thing, and making it their own, empowering themselves by taking those words and making it part of the dialogue for those artists. Have you explored that, like with this whole thing with right-wing extremism? Have you deep dived into, because like I said, there's this whole vocabulary of words that I was completely unfamiliar with prior to talking with you. And now I'm like, wow, there's all this terminology I had no idea about. Have you dived into that?
Yes. I definitely have. And I think at the moment, what I've been doing a lot in this deep dive is, I haven't come to any conclusion, of course. I don't know that I ever will, but a lot of the work, the research that I've been doing in that regard has been into the ways that other activists and other groups are able to use those same tactics to elevate social justice and human rights. And I think we do see that power, certainly, in how, for instance, certain hashtags become popular and used globally. And I think while at the same time we have this language of hate that's being disseminated across borders via the internet, we also have at the same time a language of empowerment and solidarity happening as well. And I think that for me, what I've been focusing on is how those voices happen, how those voices of solidarity and empowerment happen, and how they are disseminated and how they go viral, and how in doing that, they are then pushing out these other places on the internet, and how they are able to overcome it and insert themselves and fight. So I have been also noticing people who will appropriate certain forms of that language. I myself have not yet, but I have been paying close attention to those who do. For instance, there was a moment where a lot of right-wing extremists were calling out particularly, specifically Jewish people online as a way of inciting or encouraging people to troll those people, or to dox them, or to threaten them, and hoping that they then can promote some violence against that person. And they were doing that by putting parentheses around someone's name to inform followers, this person is Jewish, go after that person. And I found that, and I actually learned about this from one of the researchers that I had been talking to, and he told me that it completely backfired on them, because when that became known to a lot of activists and a lot of people, even moderate people online, that was their tactic, that was what they were trying to do, everyone started using the parentheses. Everyone started putting parentheses around their name on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, etc. And it confused it in a way that then empowered the right voices and eliminated that tactic. Because in some ways they were using that language against them in a way. In the same way that they were trying to use the language against them in a more hateful, inciting way. And you can argue that perhaps there's a danger in doing that, certainly, by putting parentheses around your name and being open about it. But I think also there's a power in it, in that it's saying, we're not afraid of you. We're not afraid of you. And I think that's also a very important thing that we have to do.
I also, saying something that where you take a group of people that take this idea of Proud Boys, and there was a homosexual community that came out and started showing memes of gay men, and then calling themselves Proud Boys and just calling them out, saying we're Proud Boys too, or something like that. I thought that was ingenious in the sense that, you're going to take that power away from that group and put them into something that typically for that group is probably very embarrassing. But I thought that was genius in a way.
Yeah, completely. And I think in a lot of ways, what that did was it fought hate with love. And that is a powerful thing. And that cannot be ignored for the power that love has against hate.
So here's what I wrote. Idea: hate, love, hope. Just based off of what you were saying earlier. So it's funny how we make these connections. But I think that is, if we can call out hate and try to move it into in a different direction, maybe, we can have some impact. Certainly.
That was a good example, Wes. I'd forgotten about that when I saw those memes or whatever that, in social media. And I agree with Talya. It was brilliant and a good example, like I said, of how you can kind of flip the conversation and fight it, right? Fight against, wrong doing and this hate. So great example. Whew. This has been a great conversation. We unpacked a lot as usual. And for those people that are interested in Talya's work, I encourage you to follow her on social media. Where can they find you on the social media platforms?
I am on Twitter, on Instagram. I'm also on Facebook, but I don't, to be honest, I don't use Facebook so often. But Twitter, Instagram, also, my website, and
So I will make sure that all that information is in the episode notes for this week. Talya, I cannot thank you enough for spending time with us today and talking about your work and these difficult subjects that you're tackling. I'm glad you're out there, essentially on the front lines with your art, addressing these issues, these problems, and fighting back against hate. You give me hope. I love what you do, and please continue to do it and keep us in the loop as far as the work that you're doing. I'm always happy to push out on our Facebook page and other places stuff that you're up to and you're doing. So if you make more videos or you have something that you're excited about, let me know, and I'll push it out so that people get to see it on our side of things.
And I just want to say, I'm now following you on Instagram, and I've connected with you on Facebook, and I'll look for your Twitter handle. I do appreciate what you're doing as well. I think you're doing great work. Two things. I'm really interested in seeing what you did as an undergrad painting, because that'll be easier to wrap my head around. So I'd be interested to see some images of that. even if it's just private sent to me. And I'm looking forward to what you have coming up, because you've kind of alluded to it. So I'm looking forward to the new iteration of what you're doing. So I'm excited, and I'll be watching.
Thank you. It really means a lot to hear that. And thank you for giving me this time and letting me share this. It's really meant a lot. So thank you.
Real quick, do you have anything coming up in 2021 that you can talk about as far as an exhibit or anything like that happening as of right now?
A number of my colleagues and I are going to be launching a virtual experience of our work in February that I can share. It will be a very interactive exhibition that is not like a lot of the more formal online virtual gallery spaces that we've been seeing. It's very much in line with, it kind of in some ways is a visual virtual experience based off of Discord, the Discord channels that we use as a class to communicate during this time of coronavirus. And so it will be very interesting and an experience. So I will certainly share it when it's launched.
Fantastic. Well, Talya, thank you very much. Once again, I wish you the very best in this new year of 2021.
Thank you.
You're welcome. For the Tenant Podcast, I'm Todd Pearson.
And I'm Wes Brown.
Have a great week.